Rolling Stone magazine has a new article out on Igor Danchenko, the Steele dossier so-called source. Now, the article is just full of falsehoods. Just the whole thing is just wrong on every front. We can kind of get into that a little bit, but it's almost tedious, going through all those things. I think what would be far more interesting is to, number one, reflect on that whole story, and then also, why now? I mean, what's the point now of bringing out this puff piece? Again, run in the lead up to an election and so on. What kind of game is being played here? So, I mean, viewers will, of course, remember Igor Danchenko is the so-called primary subsource of the Steele dossier. Now, very importantly, he told the FBI in January of 2017 that the whole dossier was basically made up. The words he used were, no, this is just gossip. These are just rumors that I was just like having drinks with my friends in Russia, and, we were just gossiping. That's it. So he's basically said the whole, and he also said he never expected this to be part of some dossier or intelligence report or whatever. And then, of course, the FBI concealed this guy's, because that was so explosive, that admission, the FBI concealed this guy's existence for 4 years, three and a half years or so, until we identified him. By we, I mean, a group of online researchers. That whole effort is belittled in this new Rolling Stone article, and it basically paints Danchenko as a victim because of this identification. But anyway, before we get into all the details of that, what did you make of it?
Well, I think what I made of it, first of all, was how Rolling Stone framed it. And they did so in one of the very first paragraphs. For 3 days in January 2017, Danchenko had volunteered to sit down with FBI representatives to break down what he'd learned from his multiple trips to Russia. For the next 3 years, Danchenko was a paid confidential human informant for the FBI, contributing to dozens of investigations on things like Russian malign influence efforts and compiling raw reports that were disseminated to the intelligence community. What a bunch of horseshit. The true story is what you were just discussing. Danchenko walks into the FBI, is brought in, tells them, made queen for a day, which is kind of insane for its own sake, but basically divulges that he's the primary subsource for the Steele dossier and that he doesn't know anything. He has no right to be the primary subsource for the Steele dossier, and that everything in the Steele dossier is bullshit, and the Steele dossier is, effectively a work of fiction. And what does the FBI do in response? They make him a confidential human source to hide him, so that anything that's requested about him, it's going to be redacted. It can't be released formally. So Rolling Stone, comes out with this nice portrayal of this guy who comes in, and the FBI is so glad to have him that they made him a confidential human source, and he's a wealth of information. Nonsense. He didn't know anything. The FBI realized that he was a work of fiction and thought, oh my God, people cannot see who Danchenko really is. So they actually made him a confidential human source in advance, if I remember correctly.
They did, yeah.
All designed to hide him from prying eyes, because Danchenko is a nothing. He didn't know anything.
The one point about Russiagate, which is, I think, hugely underappreciated, the one piece of evidence that proves that there was treason, actual treason, without exaggeration, literal treason on the part of people like Comey and so on, is exactly what you just said. They made him a confidential human source before they ever met him, before they knew anything about him other than having identified him. So this is something else that Rolling Stone lies about. They say he was identified by the FBI after the dossier was published by BuzzFeed in January of 2017. That's a lie. He was identified through other means by the FBI. By the way, Christopher Steele kept telling the FBI, oh, this is such a super secret source who knows Putin's innermost secrets. I could never, ever tell you who it is. And of course, this is Steele telling the FBI he's not going to tell them who it is, which should have rung huge, alarm bells. Like, well, you're supposedly giving us this dossier and you're not telling us where it came from because of some super secret source. We're not buying it. Anyway, They eventually found out who this super secret source was in December of 2016. And they could immediately see this is not some Russian insider. He knows nothing about the Kremlin. He lives in Washington, D.C.
There's
or
no
in
contacts to speak of.
He's been in the U.S. for decades, or at least a decade at that point. So the FBI knew right away that all this bullshit from Christopher Steele about this being a super secret source with close contacts and, who knows Putin's best secrets and innermost thoughts and so on, all of that was just a lie. They knew that right away just by identifying this guy and realizing that this is a Brookings Institution intern who lives in Washington, D.C. So what do? They make him a confidential human source right away before they ever talked to him, before they knew anything about him, before he even admitted that the Steele dossier was just a bunch of gossip from his, drinking buddies.
Well, and again, I think the point that you want to make sure is as soon as the FBI figured out who he was, they didn't need Danchenko to tell him that he was in no position to be a source. As soon as they identified him and knew who he was, at that moment, they knew that the whole entirety of the base of the Steele dossier was nonsense.
Right, but they also knew that this is not some guy whom they need to make a confidential human source because he's so super, such a super secret guy with super secret contacts. The only reason, as you mentioned, that they made him a confidential human source is to hide him. And the most important aspect of the hiding, hiding in terms of FOIA and so on is pretty easy. They can do that without making someone a confidential human source. They just redact everything. The most important part of this concealing Danchenko's existence, we're not even talking about concealing his name. We're talking about the fact that this person even exists. That was not known until years later, was because they wanted to hide him from congressional oversight, Devin Nunes' investigation and so on, which hadn't started then, but they knew eventually, those things will kick in. And then the guy doesn't exist. So Nunes didn't know about him. No one knew this guy existed. And that was simply to cover up the fact that the entire thing was a charade. Everything was made up. And to me, that's the treason. They didn't hire him because he had any information to offer. They hired him to conceal him from scrutiny, especially congressional oversight. And of course, so that they could continue with their Get Trump campaign, to get the special counsel and to try and get Trump removed. None of that would have been possible if we had all known back in January of 2017 that there's this guy called Igor Danchenko who knows nothing about anything and certainly not Putin's innermost secrets and who has disavowed the dossier. If that had been known, the whole thing would have just collapsed. And
you mentioned kind of at the outset where you had said that, this showed where the treason happened and this was where it was real. And that's 100% because if you look at the actions that Comey then took after having made, Danchenko a confidential human source, that's when Comey goes forth and the real efforts really began. They now have the intelligence community assessment, Russia. They got Danchenko locked into a box. Comey waited for about 6 months to brief the Gang of Eight. Brennan did it right away, but he did his own maliciousness, giving different briefings to different senators back in August in 2016. Comey waited until Trump was in office to go out and brief these same people and tell them his version of what was going on with Danchenko hidden from their eyes. They had, as you said, they had no idea that Danchenko even existed. And Comey made a formal disclosure during a hearing in March that they were investigating the Trump campaign. So, in terms of just showing these steps, Comey did these things after he already knew that the Steele dossier was a complete act of fiction, but through the use of the confidential human source, he'd kind of sewn Danchenko up into a tight little protected steel-walled bubble. And then that's when he went after Trump, knowing that everything he was saying was a lie.
Right. The congressional briefings of March of 2017 are, again, super treasonous for the reasons you just mentioned, because they knew everything was a lie, and yet they went there. Steele is highly credible, and his sources are highly credible, and they even called him Crown to kind of intimate that
this connection. Yep.
This is UK government, and every lie in the book and they told those lies back in March of 2017 with the sole purpose of, number one, getting out the fact that there is an investigation of Trump, and then of course leading on from that, getting the special counsel, and then getting Trump removed. That was the purpose. That was the idea all along. And so right after these briefings in March of 2017 is when Comey goes out and says, I can now confirm that we have an investigation, blah, 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 which he knew was a total fraud, because by that point, never mind the confidential human source, never mind all the other stuff. By that point, 2 months had already passed since Danchenko disavowed the entire dossier and said it was just rumors from his drinking buddies. So the other thing that is really grated me about this article, and again, it's a long one, and again, I don't intend to just rebut and go through it, because we'd spend all day doing that, because the entire thing is a work of fiction, and we can come back here in a moment as to why now and what's the purpose of this. But they make it out as if Danchenko's a victim because his identity was revealed and by the FBI and whatever. Nothing, or Lindsey Graham and Bill Barr and all these people are like the villains who released this guy's identity. That is absolutely not true. And all these people actually helped the FBI cover it up in one way or another. When they did release some info, everything was always extremely heavily redacted. And so this narrative that somehow people in the government helped identify this guy demeans the work of the people who actually did it. One of the first things that was done was back in 2019 when the Horowitz report came out. Again, mostly redacted, right? But there was one redaction, and our friend Walkerfire worked it out. And that was kind of the first big breakthrough. And without that, none of this identification would have happened. We'd still probably have no idea who Danchenko was. That was the starting gun on this. This was the first kind of shot, and that was Walkerfire. And what he did was there was a redaction that he worked out. It's just amazing how he does these things. I mean, I don't want to get into the sort of the nitty-gritty details. It has to do with what font is used and the size of the letters and whether something is cut off at the end of a line, and very complex. But anyway, eventually Walkerfire worked out that there was a word there that was Russian-based. That was the word, or that was the term. And it was not about Danchenko, but we were able to deduce a lot of stuff about Danchenko from that. It was about Kleinsmith. Remember the FBI lawyer
Kevin Kleinsmith
who lied about Carter Page? And he was eventually indicted by John Durham. And he was actually the only one who suffered any penalty at all. A minor, tiny slap on the wrist. But, out of all the Russiagate people, he was the only one.
Don't worry, though. He got his, despite lying about misrepresenting the CIA and everything, he got his law license back. So he's fine. He's making plenty of money now.
Yeah, he's fine. But the thing is, Durham charged him for lying about on an email, or he doctored an email to make it look like Carter Page was not a CIA source, whereas he was, and Kleinsmith knew that he was. So he
doctored a CIA email.
Right, exactly.
It's so bad.
That is so bad. But there is another one, and this is what the Horowitz thing is about. This was the redaction. Again, it's not about Danchenko. It's about Kleinsmith. But we were able to, especially after Walkerfire, was able to work out that term, Russian-based. We were able to deduce a few things. So what that whole paragraph, and it works itself into a footnote, what that was about was the fact that Kleinsmith had lied about another thing, which in my view is much worse than the Carter Page one. He lied about the fact that Steele's source was Russian-based. So again, we didn't know there was a Danchenko. We didn't know this was like the source of everything, supposedly. We didn't know any of those things. We just knew that there was a source. And of course, everyone assumed, well, if there's any credibility at all to any of this, of course the guy has to be in Russia. And the Horowitz's report said that the guy was not actually in Russia. It didn't say where he was. It didn't say he was in Washington, D.C. It didn't say it was Brookings or anything like that. It just said he was not in Russia, and that Kleinsmith lied about that too. That's what the whole thing was about. That's what the Horowitz thing was about. So to me, that's even worse, because if the guy's not in Russia, he can't know anything about anything. But anyway, he wasn't charged with that. But because of that term, Russian-based, not Russian-based. Because we found out this Russian-based thing, we were able to then work our way through. And this is months and months ahead of finding out the guy's name. There were many, many other steps along the way. And the way the Rolling Stone article kind of portrays it is that Bill Barr just leaked the guy's name. There you go. There's the guy. No. This was an extremely difficult effort, which involved a lot of people online, just random, internet researchers, without whom we would still not know anything about this whole story.
Yep. And like you said, the fingers that Rolling Stone, they're pointing right at Bill Barr and Lindsey Graham, who have plenty of their own issues. We're not trying to exonerate those guys. But in this particular case, that wasn't, that wasn't the case. Why do you think, the whole thing is just so egregious? And I think what people should kind of take away, the overarching aspect, is that the existence of Igor Danchenko and the FBI's knowledge of him, and then their subsequent their actions beforehand of making him a confidential human source, and all the actions they took after, utterly prove their complicity in trying to take out Trump. The Steele dossier should have been dead the second they knew who Danchenko was. And rather, instead of doing that, they wrapped Danchenko up, hid him away, and then continued that's really when they began their full court press against Trump, knowing the entire time that it was all a giant lie. So that is, it's proof that this was all an attack by our intelligence community, which it was. But why do you think this is coming out now?
Yeah,
when you alerted me that there was a new story on Danchenko, I was sort of like, what? Why?
Yeah, no, it's a very strange one. And why Rolling Stone and this whole victimhood thing? They're trying to maybe get ahead of something, but we don't know what that something is.
Sure feels that way.
Initially, Danchenko had gone to the New York Times. So the first smear piece against the people, the New York Times was actually a bit more honest about how Danchenko's name came to be known. Their piece, which was back in 2020, after we identified him, their piece was basically moaning about the fact, moaning is probably too weak a word, about the fact that a bunch of Trump fans had identified this poor Danchenko. That was the hook, or that was the narrative that the New York Times was pushing, which in retrospect, compared to this Rolling Stone garbage, is actually somewhat more fair because, okay, never mind the smears of Trump fans and this and that, but they actually gave credit, even though they tried to portray it very negatively, to the fact that there were a bunch of people online who did the heavy lifting to figure out this guy's name, and that without those people, those so-called Trump fans who exposed FBI source, or words to that effect that the New York Times used, without those people, as we said here a moment ago, no one, even to this day, would know anything about Danchenko. So that part of the story the New York Times was right about. So now, of course, it's completely different. Now it's Bill Barr's fault. And basically, Bill Barr told us all the name, which is completely untrue. So again, where does that come from? Why have they now changed the narrative? Why is Danchenko now telling Rolling Stone the story? The other thing, obviously the best guess is that they're trying to get ahead of some bad news, something, that might be coming up at some point. But we don't know that yet. The New York Times one was more kind of retrospective. It was like just lashing out at so-called Trump supporters because it had happened. This one seems to be more, anticipatory, something that might be happening. But
There's also a very telling sentence in this article that just has me scratching my head. On the surface of it, it's very much a narrative shaping, and it's this. During the trial, doubt was cast on Danchenko's competence in gathering information used in the Steele dossier. But FBI witnesses testified that Danchenko told the truth during his time as a confidential human informant. Now, on the face of it, that sounds good. But if you stop for a moment and think about what just got said, it's incredibly deceptive. So doubt was absolutely cast and stands on Danchenko's competence in gathering information. His own sources, that people that he cited as his sources, all of them have come out and denounced him and said that he was lying and fabricating what they said. But that's the second part of the sentence. FBI witnesses testified that Danchenko told the truth during his time as a confidential informant, not that he told the truth to Steele in the dossier. So the first part of the sentence is doubts cast on Danchenko's competence on gathering information, and then they subtly shift it and say, but he didn't lie to the FBI, as if that's proof that he was actually correct in gathering information. Both of those things are separately true. They do not prove the other. Danchenko lied, manufactured information for the Steele dossier, was in no position to know anything. Everybody that he cited, that was cited in the Steele dossier, Danchenko either said, I didn't know Steele was going to cite them, or the people themselves said they never said this to Danchenko. It's, all fiction. But yes, Danchenko did tell the truth to the FBI. Those aren't the same things, but Rolling Stone crafts that whole narrative as if it's one.
Yeah,
and it definitely has me wondering, because that's very intentional.
It is. It's frankly, it's absolutely disgusting. This entire article is completely disgusting in terms of all the lies it tells. Again,
that sentence wasn't written by accident. Those are two separable things that they're trying to use as proof of the other.
That's right. It was not written by accident, and the lies are so deliberate and so obvious. I mean, the fact that they even lied about when the FBI found out about Danchenko. We just went through that. I mean, there's so many things they lied about. How we found out about Danchenko. They lied about. They didn't even tell people that Danchenko disavowed the dossier. That's not in there. That's a fact. That's in the Durham report. We've talked about that over and over and over in many, many different ways. We proved it over and over in various ways. It's in his own words. It's in his own FBI 302 of his own interview with the FBI back in January of 2017, where he disavows the thing. Yet Rolling Stone doesn't tell anyone about that. The thing that kind of the overarching point here that is probably the most important one, other than why are they doing it now, is really kind of the issue of what's wrong with this guy. Because initially I wouldn't say sympathy. Sympathy is too strong a word, but I could perhaps understand this guy's situation or plight or whatever. He is this down and out guy. He's just a Russian name, a Russian speaker who was used by Christopher Steele to just he told me he's super secret. I can't tell you who it is. Christopher Steele just wanted to have layers of deniability. So he couldn't have written it himself. So he had to find someone else who wrote it. And then if anyone ever found out there was a problem with the dossier, he would say, oh, that's Danchenko's fault, but I can't tell you his name, Danchenko's name, because he's a super secret source or whatever. So, Steele just washes his hands and moves away. So in that sense, and by the way, he was paid a pittance. If you look at some of in that original 302, he was paid a couple of $1,000s and for a trip for all this stuff. It was like,
you're talking about
ridiculous.
By Steele.
By Steele, right.
Because he was actually paid pretty well by the FBI.
By the FBI, he was paid extremely well, but by Steele, he was kept on a very, very short leash. So anyway, I kind of, again, sympathy is too strong a word, but I wouldn't have said he's the number one, villain here. And I think John Durham made a huge mistake by making him that big villain, which he wasn't. Not up until much later. Now he is, but I'll get to that in a moment, why I think that now he is a huge villain, but he wasn't. So he was just this down and out guy. He was just paid a pittance for giving Steele this rumor and gossip from his friends. And by the way, the friends who, as you said, disavowed everything under oath, and not in a Russian court, but in a U.S. court, right? So where there might be real consequences attached to what they say. The fact that these friends existed gave Danchenko deniability. Whoa, I was just saying what my friend said. Despite that, he disavowed it. So he was being paid a pittance. The FBI suddenly shows up and says, "Hey, you gave Steele all these stories," and he panics, and he kind of comes clean. There are problems with his Queen of the Day that you mentioned, where he was brought in by Laufman, by the way, old friend of ours,
David Laufman.
Yeah,
intimately involved in the lead up in 2016.
Right, exactly. We'll have more on him. I hear on the grapevine in the coming weeks.
Yeah,
So
a very high level DOJ official, not a nobody.
right,
Way
exactly.
up
I hear
there.
from some friends of ours that there might be a bit more on him coming. I don't think that's tied in with the Danchenko, but anyway, very very bad actor. So he gives Danchenko a Queen of the Day, where Danchenko can come in, is not going to be prosecuted. He can tell them whatever, just tell us everything. Very unusual. First, you bring him in and squeeze him and figure out what you can get out of him. And then maybe later you can negotiate some kind of deal about Queen of the Day. But okay, Laufman gave him that. He came in and he did lie. There were lies that he told the FBI. But at least he disavowed the dossier. And again, at the time, he's just this guy. He just gets a pittance from Steele. He's brought in by the FBI. He's like probably genuinely a bit shocked that these drinking buddy stories have now kind of blown up a presidency and so on. The FBI then hides him away. Okay, does he have to come forward at this point? Does he have to become a whistleblower at this point? Again, I'm like, that's sort of... as I said, I don't sympathize with him, but there is an element of this guy being used as a tool, first by Steele and then later by the FBI.
Mm-hmm.
But we are now like 7-8 years later. Now's the time, or it would have been even a few years ago, to finally come clean and say, look, this was all horseshit. And I told the FBI this in 2017. They played games. They hid me away. They did this. They did that. Just come clean, tell us the truth, or just go away and into the distance and never be heard of again. But he did neither of those things. And that's why I think he has turned into a villain, because he's now come and told Rolling Stone that the stories were true.
Trying to reshape things. He's trying to, recreate, his narrative.
He's recreating the narrative.
Well, and Rolling Stone's recreating it as well.
Exactly, but to now claim that his dossier stories were true, and that there was a there and so on, that to me is beyond outrageous. It's completely unconscionable, and yeah, he's absolutely one of the bad guys now. And I did not have him in that camp. I had him as a not a victim, but just a tool, just a guy who just got paid some money to do certain things.
We were all following his tweets once he was identified, and he was you appeared as almost, like you said, kind of a tragic guy who was utterly despondent, down and out, so you could almost conjure up some sympathy for him during that time. That's over. But Hans, there's one other element that I wanted to ask you about. Wasn't the attorney for Danchenko also the attorney for another case that we've talked about on this show?
Absolutely. I think that might be one of those very, very strange overlaps, which may, again, we don't know, but may lead us to an answer as to what this article is about. What are they trying to anticipate that's going to come out? Or, we don't know, but there's certainly that angle with the lawyer. And here's what it is. So remember on the Truth Over News site, we had an article up the other week about the DNC hack.
Mm-hmm.
And that was about some news coming out of Georgia, in particular Georgia Tech, to do with freedom of information laws. So Georgia Tech was involved with the other side of the Clinton hoax. So the one side was the Steele dossier, which of course we've now talked about at length, and that was Danchenko and so on. And the other side was a guy called Sussman. People might remember Michael Sussman, Clinton campaign lawyer. And he brought this USB stick to the FBI, alleging that Trump had a secret communications channel with Putin through Russia's Alpha Bank. And it was all made up. It was a totally made up hoax. Anyway, on that second prong, the Alpha, so we got the dossier prong and the Alpha Bank prong. On that one, we had we had Georgia Tech people involved with that. We don't know the details other than what John Durham said, that they sort of they were either spoofing the false data or somehow had dug up data that was misrepresented or whatever. And in private communications, they even admitted that this whole thing doesn't fly. Right. So anyway, we knew all that. But here's the thing, and that's why your point is so intriguing. The lawyer for these Alpha Bank guys, or not Alpha Bank guys, Georgia Tech guys, is a guy called Shamo. And that's the same lawyer who represents Danchenko. So what are the chances that in the United States there are 1 million lawyers? What are the chances that the two sides of the Clinton campaign against Trump, the Russiagate hoax, the two sides of that, both are represented by the same lawyer?
And, first of all, that Georgia Tech case is an active case. There was recently a ruling that said that people who served as subcontractors, effectively, or contractors for entities that could be FOIA'd, those contractors could also be FOIA'd. So trying to get to the heart of what actually happened with those contractors, fabricating, having their data misused, whatever. There's a lot of indications that they fabricated, but we'll wait and see. That case, it's not like that case is long gone. That's an active case. We just got a ruling on that. And as you mentioned, I think it's worth kind of highlighting that these really were twin-pronged attacks. We've literally used those words in articles that we've written together to describe what was going on. That you had the Steele dossier on one path, and you had the Alpha Bank on the other path. And, the Alpha Bank hoax was the one that Clinton famously had, was it Jake Sullivan, sent out a tweet with Jake Sullivan's statement attached. They were all prepared for that hoax to hit. They were part of it. When news of that broke, within minutes, Hillary sent out a already pre-prepared tweet. So the fact that you've got the same lawyer that's crossing paths, not only with, say Danchenko and some other entity, but the twin prong of the attacks on Trump, that's intriguing. And like you said, that absolutely bears watching. And maybe there's something hidden here as to why this article is suddenly coming forth now.
As you said, there is the fact that the Georgia Tech thing is ongoing, and I'd say it's even more than ongoing. It's entering the hot phase, a very, very hot phase, because the Supreme Court in Georgia, and this is what we wrote about in our recent article, we explained, what happened there, came down with a ruling saying that those Georgia Tech IT people are subject to Freedom of Information laws, which previously they had said they weren't because they themselves said, and Georgia Tech said, and the lower courts said they weren't because they were just contractors and, they didn't need to hand over anything. Well, now the Georgia Supreme Court has said, no, you guys need to hand over all your stuff, all your emails and so on. And that has not happened yet. And that's why we're entering this hot phase. So now the Supreme Court has sent it back to the trial court and said, look, they need to hand it over. They are subject to FOIA. And now there's going to be a lot of back and forth about they're going to say, okay, we're subject to FOIA, but we're not going to hand over because, and then there's all these exemptions and exceptions and so on. So we don't know what's going to happen, but you're absolutely right. Given that we're entering into the hot phase, maybe there's something in those emails that, some other overlap, because we know that there was an overlap between the Alpha Bank hoax and the Steele hoax in the sense that it was all run out of the Clinton campaign, but they actually even met once, the two sides of the hoax. They all got together at Perkins Coie, the Clinton campaign
offices.
Offices on July 29, 2016. That's when there was a convergence. So
again in September as well, there was multiple meetings.
So we don't know what might come out, but this is a really intriguing. It's a good possibility here that there might be something there that we are not supposed to know, and Danchenko is trying to insulate against that by putting out this piece. Now that's just speculation. That might be wrong, but there has to be a reason why this piece was put out and why it was put out now.
If you and I have learned anything in all of this, it's that anytime you have an article, especially a lengthy, detailed one like this, that comes out of nowhere, and you find yourself reading it thinking, what in the heck is this thing being written about now? Why is Danchenko being, a person being reintroduced? There's always a reason for it when we find out later what that reason is. We don't know it yet, but, both of us are scratching our heads and wondering and hypothesizing.
That's right. And what ties in with that, and maybe we can sort of close on this because we haven't talked about the victims yet. So Danchenko is portraying himself as the victim. And the article doesn't talk at all about the actual victims. Now, let's break that down. There's people whose lives were ruined by this guy's actions. First on that list, of course, is Sergei Milyan. That's a poor guy who was framed by Steele and Danchenko as a dossier source. but he had nothing to do with anything. He had never met these people. He never talked to these people. Yeah, just a guy they picked out because he had once sold Trump apartments, because he had a Russian sounding name, because he was the president of the Russian American Chamber of Commerce, and because he was a Trump supporter. So they just found someone, and then they just put words in his mouth, having never met the guy, having no contact, no nothing. It's just so egregious, and they completely destroyed poor Sergei's life. By the way, there's a really strange kind of parallel here. Danchenko and Sergei are the same age. They both came to the U.S. at around the same time. They both came here seeking, a better life and so on. And one guy went and built a business, created lots of, jobs, and did amazing stuff. The other guy tried to take down a president. Disgusting. There's others too. Carter Page.
Yep. Carter Page was another consummate victim. I mean,
Yeah.
Here's Kleinsmith lying about what the CIA had represented to him, that Carter Page was, had worked with the CIA, exonerating Carter Page. And Kleinsmith literally rewrote the letter to turn that on its head, and that allowed the FISA to go on. And, Carter Page had 4 different FISAs on him the entire time for having done nothing. And here's a guy who, once he found out about it, fought to exonerate himself, and the FBI would refuse to meet with him to allow that to happen. So there was any number of victims out of this. Think about, General Flynn and what his family was put through. And instead of, they don't even touch on that. There's no mention of the people that were hurt by what happened here, but rather that Danchenko was a victim. And it's still, just that one sentence just continues to drive me bonkers, that, they doubt was cast on Danchenko's competence in gathering information used in the Steele dossier. True. Not only was it cast, it was proven. Forget about cast. It was proven, his incompetence. But then they try to validate that by, saying that witnesses testified that Danchenko told the truth as a confidential human informant. Well, yeah, he did. And that validates the FBI's complicity. And so they take these two things that independently are actually damning statements and try to turn them into positives for each other. It's a complete fabrication. And Danchenko, by the way, he was paid a pittance by Steele. He was paid very well by the FBI. Meanwhile, no restitution.
Right, yeah, exactly.
No restitution for Carter Page, for Millian, for the Flynn family. None of that is referenced here.
This lie about being truthful and cooperative, they took a page out of the FBI's book on that one. The FBI wrote in their FISA applications on Carter Page, which, by the way, were entirely based on the Steele dossier. Even Andrew McCabe admitted that without the Steele dossier, there would have been no FISA on Carter Page
without the Steele dossier. Yep.
Right. So just for those people who claim that, Steele dossier was just kind of a sideshow. No. It was the core. It was the core in every single way. It was the core in the intelligence community assessment. That was the thing that Obama hung around Trump's neck to make it look like there had been collusion and that Trump only became president because of Putin. The Steele dossier was the core of opening the Mueller investigation. When Comey went to Congress and told him a bunch of lies about the investigation, the Steele dossier over and over and over throughout this whole thing. And so with the Carter Page FISA, the FBI wrote in that FISA that Danchenko had been truthful and cooperative. Well, they didn't say who Danchenko was or whatever, just said the source. Well, he'd been truthful and cooperative in telling the FBI that the Steele dossier was a hoax, that it was just gossip from his friends. But that's how they, twisted the words around in terms of what truthful and cooperative means. They didn't tell them the second part. They just said truthful and cooperative.
Yeah, that's, at the end of the day, I think what people should take away from this is, first of all, just understand the Rolling Stone article is an absolute work of fiction. It's a rewrite of history. They do try to portray Danchenko as being this tragic figure currently, while they simultaneously make a quick note about him moving into a new 6,000 square foot house with his wife with a very high paying job as an attorney and all the luxuries that they currently have. So that's another juxtaposition that, facts versus narrative. But again, just whenever we see these things, I know for the both of us, alarm bells just start ringing like crazy. Why is this being done now? What's coming next? What are they trying to get in front of? Because this article was not created in a vacuum. It didn't happen accidentally. It was very, very carefully shaped and carefully crafted, and we don't yet know why, but we do have some suspicions.